So pure monopoly is the opposite extreme of pure competition. In pure monopoly, literally the definite, against this. Just to remind you, this is stuff that he talks about very early in chapter 10, where he identifies and talks about how we define each one of the four market structures that we'll talk about. But a monopolist is where literally there's just one single provider of the good or service in question. There's no close substitutes for the product. He talks about non-price competition, meaning what he means by that is the monopolist doesn't need to worry about competition from a price perspective because there is no competition to them in terms of the literal output for this good or service, but they do need to still try and influence consumer demand, advertise their product. They may need to differentiate their product in some way so that people will want what they produce, even though there's not technically a close substitute by any competitors. People will want what they want instead of some possible distant alternative or something like that. The real key to monopoly and understanding why monopoly, the outcome in monopoly is so different than the outcome in pure competition is the barriers to entry are significant. So in fact, literally so significant in pure monopoly that we say no other company could possibly enter the industry. That could be a variety of reasons. Could be because the firm controls a key economic resource. They have property rights and ownership control over a key economic resource that nobody else would be able to gain access to. Sometimes the government grants monopoly power in the form of a patent or copyright protection. We have copyright and patent protection laws in place to foster innovation so that companies will innovate and create new products and not have to worry about other competitors stealing it away from them. Patents and copyrights only last for a period of time though, so that's not indefinite. Usually they enjoy some very large economy of scale, meaning the operation is pretty intensive with regard to capital assets. So it's a heavy capital asset type of production environment. And because of that, they enjoy an economy of scale. And the most significant bullet point on here is the fact that the monopolist is a price maker. If you remember back to chapter 10, when he first started talking about pure competition, every firm operating in a purely competitive market is a price taker. They're faced with accepting whatever the market price for their product is, and they don't have the ability to control that price in any way. So we refer to the firm operating in pure competition as a price maker, whereas the monopolist is the exact opposite. They're the price maker. So what that simply means is they get to establish the output and price. They're not stuck with whatever the market price given to them is. And so your author has a schedule of a demand schedule, which is what the first two columns in this chart represent. It's output and price. We've looked at many demand schedules in this course by now. You should be comfortable with that. Total revenue is calculated. A lot of you'll see pretty quickly why, if you understand everything that was going on in chapters 10 and 11, really chapter 10, those could have been combined into one, but if you understand everything that was going on there, the rest of this is somewhat redundant in a lot of ways. Total revenue is price times quantity, as it always has been. We've always calculated total revenue that way, so it's the price that you sell each unit for, not units that you produce and sell. I'll remind you that I said this earlier. We assume that when a company produces something, they sell it and generate revenue. That's not necessarily reality, but that's a simplifying assumption we make in these models. So by definition, if they produce it, they do sell it. So in other words, if this company were to produce 5 units, they would sell 5 units and they would sell all 5 units for $122. That's just a simplifying assumption. So you just, again, multiply the quantity of output in column 1 times the price in column 2 to get total revenue in column 3. Marginal revenue is calculated exactly the same as we have been calculating marginal revenue. It's the change in total revenue divided by the change in output. So for example, if we didn't produce anything, obviously we don't get any total revenue. When we produce and sell only one unit, we can sell that unit for $162. So total revenue changes from 0 to 162. And that's a change of 162. So the additional revenue generated when we produce that first unit is the $162 price of that first unit. If we decide we're going to produce 2 units, we can do that, but we can't violate demand. And that's actually a kind of a tripping point for students sometimes, is that students think that because this is a monopolist that they can somehow violate the law of demand. We can't violate the law of demand. The demand curve facing the monopolist is the demand curve that would be facing an entire industry in a purely competitive market model. Demand is made up of the collective willingness and ability of all the consumers in a marketplace to buy some quantity of output at various different prices. What I'm saying is the monopolist does not directly control and dictate what each quantity demanded is at various different prices. Only consumers do that. So they're at the mercy of what the consumer side of the market is, just like a purely competitive firm is. So point of that is, if the demand schedule says if they want to sell 2 units, they can sell 2 units, but they've got to make the price $152. That's what the consumer side of the market is telling them. We'll buy 2 units, but we'll only do it if you set the price at $152. So if they sell 2 at $152, they generate $304 in total revenue. If you subtract total revenue from one unit, the 162, from the 304, that's 142. So the marginal revenue of the second unit is 142. Does everybody see that? If they want to sell 3 units, they can do that, but again, they have to comply with the law of demand, so they can sell 3 units at $142, generate $426 in total revenue. If you subtract 304 from that, you get marginal revenue of $122. So a couple of really important points to be made. I've already made the first most important point, is that demand is what it is. The monopolist does not directly control what demand for their product is. 2, the marginal revenue of the first unit is exactly the same as the price. And I hope that makes sense, because obviously until you produce that first unit, you can't generate any revenue, and whatever revenue you generate from producing that first unit would have to be exactly equal to the price of that first unit. So the marginal revenue and the price of the first unit produced and sold will always be the same. It's another important point. But beyond that, probably the most important point is, beyond that first unit produced and sold, the price and the marginal revenue are no longer the same, correct? In fact, at the second unit, the price is 152, the marginal revenue is 142. For 3 units, the price is 142, marginal revenue is 122. So beyond that first unit produced and sold, the marginal revenue is less than the price, and that will always be the case for any. In fact, this will be true for monopolistic competition and oligopoly when we get to those chapters next week. The same will be true there. Anytime there's not pure competition, marginal revenue will be less than demand, or less than the price. Demand is a reflection of the price, after all. So it's fair to say marginal revenue would be less than demand or price, either one, beyond the first unit produced and sold. Why is the marginal revenue of that second unit not the same thing as the price? When we produced and sold the first unit for 162, the marginal revenue and the price were the same thing. Why is the marginal revenue and the price not the same thing for the second unit?
Because the price is the average revenue. And so to get that second unit, we're basically selling it at a lesser price.
Yeah, there you go. In other words, we can sell 2 units for 152 if we want to. That's what the law of demand says. But we can't get 162 for the first one and then get 152 for the second one. Now, it is possible sometimes that you can do that. Your author talks about that. But in this first instance, we assume that they can't do that. If they want to sell 2, they've got to sell each of them for 152. So you kind of have to give back $10 in a way on that first unit. right? You give up $10 worth of revenue on that first unit produced and sold because you can't sell it for 162. If you want to sell two, you have to sell it for 152. And that's exactly why the marginal revenue and price differ beyond that first unit produced and sold. Now, if you could sell that first unit for 162 and retain that revenue and then turn around and sell a second unit for 152 and a third unit for 142, you'd love to be able to do that, right? Because you'd get more revenue, more total revenue as a result of doing that. We call that price discrimination, and sometimes firms do have the ability to price discriminate. And when they can, they certainly will, because we always assume rational behavior, and all firms want to maximize their profit. So if a firm has the ability to price discriminate, they will. And what that means is they'll sell unit, the same thing, same exact thing, but sell that same thing at different prices. Sometimes students hear discrimination and they think, well, that must be illegal. They can't be allowed to do that. And there's no law against price discrimination. It's all around us. We see it all the time, every day in our everyday lives. Probably the best example of that is you fill a plane jet going from Chicago to LA, fill it with 200 people. They're all getting the same exact service, right? They're getting from point A in Chicago to point B in LA. What are the chances they all paid the same exact price for that airline ticket? If you've ever traveled, you know that probably pretty slim, right? There's probably at least, on a plane of 200 people, there's probably at least 100 different prices that were paid for those tickets, right? Because we price discriminate all the time. So, and I don't even mean just between, first class and coach. Say it's Southwest where all the seats are exactly the same. People still aren't paying the same price for those seats. It depends on when you buy them, how far in advance you buy them, staying over a weekend, all that stuff. Movie theater, fill a movie theater full of people, and not everybody in that movie theater paid the same exact price for that ticket, right? There's military discount, student discount, elderly discount, whatever. You get the idea, right? So price discrimination is all around us all the time. There's no law against it. It's perfectly legal. And when firms can, they absolutely will price discriminate. In this first model of monopoly, we assume that they do not have the ability to price discriminate. And in fact, there are a lot of instances where price discrimination wouldn't be practical, wouldn't be possible for them to do. All right, so if you graph that demand schedule, the first two columns on that chart, you see the blue demand curve, and that's a typically downward slope demand curve like you would expect. And if you graph the marginal revenue curve along with it, that's the red curve on here, you can see that at the first unit produced and sold, they're the same. We've established that. But as you produce more and more output, the marginal revenue differs from the price by a greater amount. So not only does the marginal revenue curve lie below the demand curve, but it gets farther away from the demand curve the greater the output is. And that might seem obvious at this point, but I can tell you that there will be students that will switch that around and somehow end up with a marginal revenue curve that ends up lying above the demand curve. That's never possible. You could never have a marginal revenue curve that was above, or marginal revenue being above the price or above the demand curve. That's very different from, this is kind of where you can really compare and contrast pretty distinctly the purely competitive model from the monopoly model. So I've put on the bottom right hand side, just as a reminder, this is what you can ignore. I just copied a graph from the last presentation a couple weeks ago, but what I want you to focus on is this horizontal marginal revenue curve. Remember, in a purely competitive market, price, demand, marginal revenue, they were all synonymous. And importantly, the demand curve facing that purely competitive firm was perfectly elastic. It wasn't downward sloped. And unlike this one, price and the marginal revenue were the same thing. So here, price and marginal revenue are the same thing. Here, price and marginal revenue are different. That's really the first key contrasting point between the two. Your author talks about the fact that when the monopolist increases output, there's really two things at play that kind of counteract. One counteracts the other one, and that is the output effect by itself. What the output effect says is, if I produce more output, yes, I'm going to generate additional revenue, right? Because as I produce more stuff, we assume it all gets sold. My revenue is going to go up just by virtue of the fact that I've increased my output. But the price effect mitigates some of that output effect, because you have to lower the price in order to sell those additional units of output. So the price effect causes total revenue, doesn't cause total revenue to go down, but it causes the total revenue to not increase by the same amount as the price. Again, it's just a different way of looking at why the marginal revenue and the price are two different things. I've said before a number of times that all firms will maximize their profit in a way, so it doesn't matter whether we're talking about pure competition or monopoly or anything in between. All firms will choose to maximize their profit by producing marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal, so we've looked at that a bunch. In pure competition, in the long run, we left with this on Monday. What happens in the long run in pure competition in a market like that is that the price, the marginal revenue, and the marginal cost all end up being equal. Not only that, it ends up being equal at the lowest point on the average total cost curve. Remember, one of the last slides we talked about last time was the fact that the long run outcome of a purely competitive industry is that we become production efficient, which is why we end up at the lowest point on the average total cost curve, and allocatively efficient, which is identified by the fact that price and marginal cost end up being equal. But with a monopolist, as we'll see here graphically, it's easier to see. With a monopolist, the price will always be greater than wherever that intersection of the marginal revenue and marginal cost curve is. I hope that's obvious, because if the marginal revenue curve lies below demand always, just picture one of those U-shaped marginal cost curves on here, the intersection of that's always going to be below that, correct? So the price will always have to be greater than that intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. So this is really, these last two lines on here are really the big reason why that matters. I've repeated another slide in here just to remind you that some of the concepts are many of the concepts are the same, and we looked at profit per unit quite a bit during the material in chapter 10. And profit per unit is always taken by subtracting the average total cost from the price, and then that gives you profit per unit. You have to multiply that by the number of units to get the total profit, which is why profit ended up being that rectangular area on our average cost graphs and average revenue. I also said pretty early on, one of the things we like about this book is that the author develops all the cost information in chapter 9, and he uses that same cost data throughout all the way through chapter 14, I believe. Yeah, 14. So he doesn't change the cost at all. We don't have to keep reinventing the wheel on cost. He just does assume now this same cost structure applies to a monopolist instead of a purely competitive firm. Not realistic, but it doesn't alter the model in any way. So what I'm saying is got to this point, marginal revenue today, average total cost, and marginal cost columns. That's the same data we've been using since chapter 9. So that should look familiar to you. I've calculated the profit or loss. We've done this before too. Remember, that's simply calculated by subtracting total cost from total revenue. So this monopolist doesn't sell anything. Obviously, they don't generate any revenue. They have $100 worth of fixed cost, as we have had since chapter 9. So if you subtract 100 from 0, you get negative 100. It's their fixed cost only. They don't produce anything. They generate 162 in total revenue if they produce and sell one unit. That costs them 190 to do that. So if you subtract 190 from 162, you get negative 28. Finally, at the second unit, when they generate 304 in total revenue and have 270 in cost, they finally have a positive economic profit. You can see in the numbers in that column reflect the profit or loss calculation all the way down. So if you were this monopolist, how many would you produce? What's the greatest profit? 140 for 5 units, right? Yeah. Seemed like a silly question, didn't it? An idiot, of course you'd produce 5. Yeah, obviously every firm wants to maximize their profit, right? Well, if you look at marginal revenue and marginal costs, remember we focus so much attention on that, always compare those two, and if marginal revenue exceeds cost, you produce that unit. So I'm not going to go all the way to the top, but let's say we're producing here at 3 units. Would I produce the 4th unit? Yes or no? Well, if I produce the 4th unit, I generate $102 in additional revenue and only $60 in additional cost. So obviously I'm going to do that one. Would I produce the 5th unit? Well, I generate 82 in marginal revenue and 70 in cost. So yeah, I produce the 5th one. Would I produce the 6th one? We know the answer is no, but why no? Because the marginal revenue is 62 and the marginal cost is 80. So now all of a sudden my marginal cost would exceed my marginal revenue, and that would cause my profit to go down, correct? So again, obviously it's easy to pick out 140 and say, be done with it, move on, but I want you to always focus your attention on that equality of marginal revenue and marginal cost. In the second to the last column, I have calculated the elasticity coefficient for this demand curve. I know that sends chills up your spine. Don't worry, I'm not going to have you calculate the elasticity coefficient on the next exam. But I did tell you when we talked about elasticity that this was a concept that we would use again in this course. And here it is, and not for the last time, I will say. So I'm not going to have you calculate elasticities on exam number 3, although you should be able to do that. But I'm most concerned with, if you remember back to chapter 6, the elasticity chapter, there was a really important relationship between what happens to total revenue when you change the price and what the elasticity coefficient was. And what we established there, and I spent a lot of time doing this because I really wanted to emphasize this, was that if you lower the price and you're in an elastic region of a demand curve, remember, straight line demand curve has varying elasticities all the way along its path. So it starts high at the upper left-hand portion, and as you work your way down to the right along a downward sloping demand curve, the elasticity coefficient gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, what we established there was if you lower the price when you're in an elastic region of a demand curve, the total revenue will go up. And in this table, you go over here to the second and third column, starting at the top going down, we're lowering the price all the way down. In fact, specifically, every time we move down a row, we're lowering the price by $10. Look what happens to total revenue as we lower the price. As you go down, you lower the price, total revenue goes up, goes up, goes up, up, goes up, up, goes up there. And then finally, only when you get to the last one, when you lower the price from 82 to 72, only then does the total revenue go down. We'll look at the elasticity coefficient. That certainly supports what we said, what we would expect to happen if you lowered the price. As long as the elasticity coefficient was elastic, total revenue rose. Only when the elasticity coefficient became less than 1 or inelastic did lowering the price cause total revenue to go down. All things being equal, if you're a producer of any type, monopoly or otherwise, you want to, if you're going to lower the price to increase output, you want your total revenue to go up, right? You don't want your total revenue to go down. It's one important piece of the profit equation. For that reason, your author makes a point to say that monopolists, and this is certainly true in the long run, monopolists will always set their price in the elastic region of a demand curve. If it's not possible for a monopolist to set their price in an elastic region of a demand curve, that's probably not a monopoly that would ever exist in the long run anyway. Make sense? All right. So let's look at this graphically, the way we have looked at this graphically for pure competition. Again, the average total cost curve and the marginal cost curves here are exactly the same cost curves we've been using, so those are no different. And now I've added that demand and marginal revenue curve that we had a few slides ago. I've just superimposed that on here. And without regard to the numbers that are up here, the profit maximizing rule says you always focus your attention on, and I want to really emphasize this for those of you that are really comfortable with this. I apologize, but after exam 2, I could tell a lot of people weren't all that comfortable with this. So it's even becomes more important from here on out. So the profit maximizing rule says produce where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal. So find that intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. From that point, go straight down vertically to the x-axis. That tells you the quantity that you would produce. Well, here, that falls right in between 5 and 6, right? This always confuses students, especially on the test. When it falls in between, we can't produce and sell a partial unit. So we've got to either sell 5 or 6. We can't sell anything in between. So then you're faced with, well, which way do I go? You always want to choose the one to the left. And the reason for that is because that's the one where the marginal revenue would still exceed the marginal cost. If you choose the one to the right, the greater quantity of output, then the marginal cost exceeds the marginal revenue, and that would cause your profit to go down. So rarely will marginal revenue and marginal cost ever be exactly equal at an equal number of, a whole number of units of output. That almost never happens. Now, if we were to say these weren't outputs of 1 unit, let's say these were in units of 1,000, well, that would be different, right? You could go to this intersection point, go down here, and if there was enough scale down here, you could say, okay, that's 5,400. All right, well, that's the quantity that you would choose. So just make sure that you don't choose the quantity that's greater. I see students do that a fair amount on the exam. You don't want to do that. Does that make sense to everybody? The other thing I want to emphasize, and students lose sight of this frequently too, is that marginal revenue, marginal cost rule, and we've been using it this way all along, but I think sometimes it slips people's mind. What that tells you is how many to produce. That's all that tells you, is the number of units you would produce. If you produce that many units, you'll maximize your profit. It doesn't tell you what the price is. And I say that because, and I understand why students do this. In pure competition, it didn't matter because price and marginal revenue were the same thing. So it wasn't a problem there. Now all of a sudden, they're not the same thing. Well, that's a big problem. And here's the point I'm making. We focus our attention so much on marginal revenue and marginal cost because it's like kicking a dead horse. We don't get away from it. Your tendency on the exam is, once you determine how many you produce, you need to know what the price is. Well, your tendency is going to want to be to go to this intersection point and go over here to the left to the price axis, right? The dollar axis. And that's not right. But I guarantee you somebody will do that on the exam. What's the price? What tells you what the price is? The demand curve, right? Yeah, only the demand curve tells you what the price is. Again, in pure competition, it didn't matter because price and marginal revenue were the same thing. But here, very different. So you've got to go up. Once you determine the 5 units, follow that up vertically all the way up to the demand curve. And that's the price that you would sell each unit at, not something down here like 75. Well, guess what? On the exam, one of your A, B, C, D choices is going to be 75, and the other one's going to be 122. Somebody will pick 75 every time. Students are tricked into it every time. Don't let that be you. Does that make sense to everybody? Only the price, or only the demand curve tells you what the price is. So the marginal revenue, marginal cost rule tells you how many. That's the x-axis. The demand curve tells you what the price is. That's the y-axis. So at that quantity of output, go up to the demand curve and then go over to determine what the price is. Now I labeled it here just because there's not enough scale over here. If you go back to the table, you can see that was a price of 122 per unit of 5 units. That makes sense to everybody? All right. And then we get to the profit per unit, like I think it was just the previous slide ago said, just like we did in, that becomes very much the same like we did in pure competition. Once you've identified how many and what the price per unit is, take from that price, go down and see what the average total cost per unit is. So 5 units, you can just follow that up. Average total cost, where that intersects average total cost is the average cost per unit. That's 94. Again, I only labeled it because there wasn't enough detail for here to do that. You can go back to the table and verify that. So when we produce 5 units, we get a price of $122 per unit. The cost on average per unit for each one of those 5 units is $94. So if you subtract 94 from 122, you get 28. So the average profit's 28. But remember, that's just the average per unit. You've got to multiply that 28 by the 5 units you produce, and 28 times 5 is 140. So that rectangular area is economic profit. Let's see. So in industries where profit exists, those industries expand, correct? Well, except in monopoly. Why? Because the monopolist, there is no competition that can enter, correct? So in pure competition, anytime there were profits, other firms would jump in and want a piece of that action, and that would cause the supply curve to shift to the right, causing the price to go down. Well, here, one of the significant features of the monopoly is barriers to entry are significant, meaning literally, in a literal sense, we say competitors can't enter the industry. So while competitors might love to enter this industry because there are economic profits, for whatever reason, whether it be copyright protection or control of key economic resource or whatever, they can't. And so the monopolist isn't faced with any competition, so he would continue to enjoy this $140 profit in this instance. Are we productively efficient in this outcome? What's the definition of productive efficiency? Producing in a least cost way, right? And we knew we were productively efficient in long run pure competition at the end of the day Monday because we ended up producing at the lowest point. The quantity of output that was produced was at the lowest point on the average total cost curve, right? Are we producing at the lowest point on the average total cost curve in this scenario? How would you identify the lowest point on the average total cost curve on this graph? If I were to ask you how many units of production would this firm minimize its average total cost, how would you identify that?
Where the marginal cost equal to ETC.
Yeah, there you go. This light blue marginal cost curve. Remember, the marginal cost curve always intersects the, in this case, the green average total cost curve. It always intersects at its lowest point, correct? So the minimum quantity of output that they could produce that would minimize their average total cost would be what? 7 units, right? In fact, you go back. So you can verify that right there. $91.43 is the lowest average total cost, correct? Well, we're producing up here at 5 at an average total cost of 94. That's not the lowest, is it? Monopolist only cares about maximizing their profit. They don't care about minimizing their cost, right? I mean, might sound a little counterintuitive, but if you ran a business and you had to choose between minimizing your cost or maximizing your profit, which one would you choose? Maximizing your profit, right? We assume rational behavior. minimizing your cost is not necessarily, as you can now see, not necessarily consistent with maximizing your profit. So the point is, we're not producing in a productively efficient way. That's to be sure. Are we producing in a productively efficient way? 5 units of production. How would you identify being allocatively efficient? The price has to be equal to anybody? In the long run, in pure competition, I know I have it. There it is. In a purely competitive market, price equals marginal revenue equals marginal cost, correct? Then I said, but for the monopolist, because the marginal revenue curve always lies below demand, the price will always be greater than that, right? So the price is not equal to marginal cost is the point. See that clearly on the graph. If we produce 5 units, the price is up here at 122, and the marginal cost is way down here at whatever that marginal cost of 5 units is. Everybody see that? So price is not equal to marginal cost. Price is not equal to the minimum average total cost. So therefore, we're not productively, nor are we allocatively efficient. And that's, if you ask somebody, is monopoly good, bad? Everybody knows. You don't need an economics course to, if you've lived on this earth long enough to be to this point in your life, you pretty much figure that monopoly is not a good thing, right? Most people know that, but don't really understand why monopoly is not a good thing. And the reason is because we pay a higher price and get less of whatever the good is. If a monopolist controls the entire output market, from society's perspective, we get less and pay more. So that's, and this is a visual illustration of that. That's why we don't like monopoly power. Any questions about that? All right, I think I make that point here. So this is just a more generic supply and demand curve. And remember, we're allocatively efficient when we produce where the demand and the supply curve are equal. It's also where we maximize total market surplus. Consumer and producer surplus are both maximized when we produce at that intersection point. Well, in a purely competitive market in the long run, like chapter 11, what we saw was we actually did end up being at that productively and allocatively efficient level of production. This is where we identify the allocatively efficient part of that. But now, because we have a situation where the marginal revenue curve lies below the demand curve, and we produce at output, QC is the way he identifies the output in pure competition. But if you turn that into a monopoly model, the output is Q sub M for the monopolist. Obviously, we get less output, as I just said, and we pay a higher price for it. Because QM, obviously, that's price PM, a higher price than what the price would be in a purely competitive market. So this is an inefficient outcome, to put it in the language that we used in chapter 4. This is an inefficient outcome, right? We've lost some amount of consumer and producer surplus. And we've seen this before. That's identified by the deadweight loss, right? So here, again, to put it in the language of chapter 4, when an industry is characterized as a monopoly, we end up with a deadweight loss and an inefficient outcome because we're underproducing this good or service. In other words, we're not devoting enough resources to the production of this good or service. We should be producing more, meaning we should be devoting more resources to the production of this good or resource. But the monopolist doesn't care whether we as a society are best off, right? They only care about their profit maximization. Agree with that? All right. In a more generic version of that graph, no real numbers here, but just to compare and contrast and make the point that he's making here in a second. This is what profit looks like for a monopolist who cannot price discriminate. So this would be an entirely different set of data than what we've been looking at. If you were shown this on a graph, in fact, I wish I'd shown this without the yellow information on here, but if I showed you this graph and said, what would profit look like? Identify like some of those questions on exam 2, like identify the different 4 points of the rectangle. So identify what would be the bounds of that rectangle type of thing. I would hope you could look at this and very quickly, the way you make quick work of this is, okay, you always look for where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal. In fact, assume they didn't even have these dashed lines here, right? Look for where those are equal. Go down to the x-axis, that tells you how many. Once you determine how many, you got to go all the way up to the demand curve to determine what the price per unit is. What would be that price over there? It's not identified here, but whatever where that arrow is, that would be the price per unit. Subtract from that price per unit the average total cost. That gives you the average profit. Multiply it by the output, in this case Q1, and you get that yellow rectangle. That's for the non-price discriminating monopolist. But remember I said if a monopolist could price discriminate, in other words, if they could sell the first unit at a higher price than the second unit, and the second unit at a higher price than the third unit, and so on and so forth, they'd love to do that because obviously their profit wouldn't go up. That wouldn't affect their cost in any way, would it? So if they can do that, then again, now their marginal revenue curve and their demand curve now become synonymous again, because they're selling, every time they would sell a next unit of something, they would be selling that unit and getting exactly the revenue equal to whatever the price of that unit was. So unlike the non-price discriminating monopolist, price and marginal revenue end up being the same thing again. And so what does profit look like for a price discriminating monopolist? Looks like what's shaded in yellow here. It's not a perfect triangle, but close to it. And so you'd still maximize it. It still doesn't violate the principle of equating marginal revenue and marginal cost. We still do that. So it just happens now that marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal over here where the marginal cost curve intersects the demand curve. So you produce Q2 units of output. And once you determine how many units, in this case Q2, that's the price or the average total cost per unit for every unit you produce. It doesn't matter what you sold each one of those units for, that's the average total cost per unit. So if you sold that first unit way up here at this price and subtracted from that average total cost, you'd get this profit on the first unit sold. And then you'd sell the next unit for a little lower price, but your average total cost would be the same. So your profit per unit on that second one would go down a little bit, and then the third one would go down a little bit, and the fourth, and so on and so forth. So the ability to price discriminate would dramatically increase the profit for a monopolist. But the point to be made here is that the profit visually would not look like that rectangle that we've been looking at so far. It would be this almost triangular area on this graph. All right. Oh, by the way, you are to assume, unless told otherwise, for any homework problem or an exam question, assume, if you're not told, that there is no price discrimination occurring. So I will tell you specifically in a particular type of question, if assume this monopolist has the ability to price discriminate. So you would specifically be told price discrimination. If you're not told, assume there isn't price discrimination. All right. So if monopoly's bad, we don't like monopolies, how do we deal with monopolies? Well, there's a lot of different ways, a lot of debate too, frankly, among the ways whether you should even be too concerned with monopoly power. But to the extent that a monopoly or some monopoly power exists, And we still want that out. Like, what's a good example of a monopoly?
Time Warner.
Time Warner, yeah, no doubt. Time Warner. Time Warner is in fact, somebody in my class last night said that same thing. Time Warner, I think people loathe Time Warner. It's not even Time Warner anymore, is it Spectrum? Oh, I absolutely hate that company, but I'm like, we're all prisoners too. I don't use their cable TV service. I only use their internet because I stream everything. If you want internet, true high-speed internet, are you not pretty much stuck with Time Warner or Spectrum, whatever they're calling now? Yeah, no doubt. It's a really good example of that. In fact, that's a perfect example for this, Abigail. Thank you. We don't regulate Time Warner, but what if we were to regulate Time Warner in some way? You know, if their monopoly power is so great that that's to the detriment. And remember, how does the detriment to us manifest itself? We get less and we pay more, right? Primarily, it's the paying more part that we don't like, right? So, why don't we regulate Spectrum? Why don't we regulate?
The FTC's lazy.
Maybe. How might a politician justify, Time Warner, Spectrum, they're nothing there. That's not anything to be concerned with. How would they justify that?
Maybe it brings a satisfaction to like consumers and don't really worry about it because it bring them benefits in a way. I don't know.
No, probably not so much. How about electricity? Let's compare Spectrum to electricity. Who do you get your electricity from? DP&L. We even actually have the ability to get electricity from different providers, but DP&L still owns the infrastructure. So the way it gets into our home is DP&L, so you still receive your bill from DP&L, but you might actually be paying for your electricity from some other company. But let's say that didn't happen, because that hasn't been that way for very long, really, relatively speaking. 20 years ago, if you want electricity in your house in the Miami Valley, you were pretty much paying for DP&L. Well, we did regulate DP&L. In fact, we regulated them in a way that I'll discuss here in a minute. Well, why would politicians and regulators decide that, well, we needed to regulate DP&L? I would argue that Time Warner has every bit the monopoly that DP&L once had for electric power. Why did we feel the need to regulate DP&L but not Time Warner?
Is it because internet's a luxury?
Yes, exactly. We need electricity, right? I guess we could argue, debate that perhaps, but regulators look at it and say, look, people can't live without electricity. They can live without the internet. They can live without their cable TV and their high-speed internet, but tough to live without your electricity. And that's exactly why we regulate it. I don't know where this is going to go, honestly. One of the gazillion now Democrat candidates running for president, Elizabeth Warren, I think her name for a second. One of her things she's advocating for is that we really get tough on monopolies. And I'm not a Democrat, but I will tell you that I certainly do agree with that. I do think we should take a tougher stance, because historically, and your author talks about this, historically, what's happened with regulation of monopoly power, we go through these cycles. We go through periods, and they're purely political cycles. We go through periods where politically we take a tough stand against monopoly power, and we do, from a regulatory perspective, pretty aggressive things to mitigate that monopoly power. But then we go through these cycles where we just kind of like take this hands-off approach. And I would tell you that we've been in a political cycle now for, I'd say a good 20 years, where we've taken very much a hands-off approach to monopoly power in a lot of ways. And Elizabeth Warren's advocating for, we need to get back to taking a tougher stand. There's a lot of big monopoly companies. Now she doesn't pick on cable companies, to my knowledge, but I throw them in there too. But she's picking on the likes of Google and Amazon and Twitter, the big social media giants, which arguably they too have monopolies at what it is that they do. So, anyway, that is exactly why we would regulate electricity utilities, whereas we wouldn't regulate cable TV or internet access. Not saying that's right. I think we should regulate that. So if we were to regulate, so in other words, why didn't, if the monopoly in electricity from DP&L was so bad, we couldn't just say, well, you can't, how do you break up DP&L, right? How do you break up and create a bunch of different electricity providers? Now, we ended up doing that in a very creative way, in my opinion. But originally, you look at that and you say, okay, we want to create competition in electricity. How do you do that? Who's going to start? I mean, you look at talk about barriers to entry, look at the capital requirements necessary to create the infrastructure to get electricity into our homes, right? Have all the telephone poles and the wiring or underground wiring and meter boxes on the sides of houses. I mean, that's a huge can you imagine ripping all that out and starting from scratch, or having some other company come in and say, you can do these houses and somebody else can do these? It'd be a nightmare, right? Or houses would be torn up, yards would be a mess and everything. So the way we finally deregulated that industry to a degree, and it is still heavily regulated, but the way we deregulated that from a competitive standpoint is when you purchase electricity, regardless of who you decide to purchase your electricity from, like I think the company I buy electricity from is in Columbus, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember who it is, but nobody came in and ripped out the meter on my house and lines in my yard and hooked up new stuff, right? The electricity provider I buy my electricity from, it just gets pumped into my house the way water gets pumped into my house. It's metered through DP&L. DP&L is the one that comes out and reads the meter. They're the ones that send me the bill every month, and they get a fee for doing that. So it's called line leasing, and what happens is all these electricity providers that we can now choose from, a part of that fee that we pay them actually is the fee, actually DP&L literally just takes it right off the top, is the fee that they receive for providing that infrastructure, because nobody would ever come in and recreate that infrastructure. It'd be too disruptive to society.
They set price ceilings for
They do, as a matter of fact, yes. That is a very common way that we would regulate utilities. In fact, it's a good segue. Let's jump into that. So if monopoly power exists, but we still, obviously, we want that good or service, right? We want our electricity, we want our high-speed internet. If a federal regulator were to deem that monopoly power exists without any regulation whatsoever, this is just kind of a recap of where we've been today. Without regulation in this market, we would end up getting, because here's marginal cost, here's marginal revenue, we get this QM output, which is the monopoly outcome, and we pay price PM. Well, if that's too high a price, we could regulate that, and there's actually way more different regulatory, in actual practice, different regulatory practices than the oversimplification that we do here. But the two main ones, and what actually happens in reality, these happen in reality too, but more often than not in reality, it's some hybrid version of these things. But one strategy is, okay, monopolist, you need to exist because the barriers to entry are so high. So we don't want to run you out of business, but we're going to regulate you in a way that you would earn a normal profit, just like purely competitive firms would earn a normal profit in the long run if there was competition. And the way to do that is to employ what's called a fair price strategy. So we could regulate them in a fair price way. And the fair price strategy says you regulate them to the extent that their price has to be equal to their average total cost. And if the price is equal to the average total cost, then they make a zero economic profit, correct? Which is why that's called fair, because firms operating in pure competition have to settle for zero economic profit in the long run. Remember, it doesn't mean they're not making a normal profit. They are making a normal profit, but they're just not making an economic profit over and above that, which is where that term fair comes from. It's fair. If it's fair for firms operating in purely competitive markets, it's fair for you too, buddy. Well, that's pretty easy because you could just say, well, you have to set your price equal to whatever your average total cost is. So just look for wherever average total cost intersects. Again, demand is always a reflection of price, remember. So demand curve tells you what the price is. So if you look for where the average total cost curve intersects the demand curve at that yellow point right there, follow that down. That's Q sub F, the little sub F, I'm assuming stands for fair price. They would earn a normal profit, so they would not have any reason to leave the industry. They're not happy. I'm not suggesting they'd be happy at that, but they would be earning a normal profit. We would be paying a lower price, the P sub F price, because that is the average total cost. So we'd pay a lower price and get more output. So we're happy. They may not be happy, but at least they're earning a normal economic profit. If they had to endure pure competition, like a lot of other industries, that's exactly the outcome that they would end up at anyway.
So like Duke Energy down in Cincinnati, do they, for the same exact house, do they pay, does the person have to pay more for their supply down there because it's a higher demand for it down there, I guess, because there's more houses and richer neighborhoods? Or?
No, actually, who regulates energy prices in Ohio?
AP, is it out of Columbus?
Yeah, it is. It's part of our state government. Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, PUC. They're the ones that regulate all utilities, not just electricity, but they regulate telecommunications, electricity, natural gas, hopefully one day maybe high-speed internet, who knows. But that would be the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. And what they do is they establish the maximum amount that DP&L, like the line lease fees. So they establish the maximum amount. Company can charge less if they want, but they establish the maximum amount that the companies that actually own and provide the infrastructure to get electricity to our home. And they also regulate the price of the energy itself. Now that's becoming far less of an issue now because of competition. That's kind of the whole idea of introducing competition. And when we deregulated the industry, so now, you know, you can choose from, I don't know if I have Duke Energy to choose from, although I'd be surprised if it wasn't one of the choices, but you know, you can go to a website and how many of you have electricity in your own name? I know a lot of you live in homes, but you know, there's a website you can go to and key in your address, and it will give you the list of all providers that will provide electricity to you for that address. You'd be surprised if you go to that website, you've got far more choices than what you think. That's competition, because the way they set that fee, you know, you're always, if you're shopping for electricity usage, for example, you're always going to shop for that on a per kilowatt hour basis. And that's where the competition and price comes in. So the Public Utilities Commission has largely had to get out of the business of regulating what we pay for the actual electricity itself. They now regulate the line lease charge, because that's where the real monopoly power exists, is getting the electricity into our homes. They set the maximum amount for that at the state level. So again, companies can go less than that if they want, although they rarely ever do go less than that. So usually we're all paying about the maximum amount we could pay for those line lease fees. They don't call them line lease fees on your bill. I can't remember what they call it. Something called something else on your bill. Something distribution charge, I think, or something like that. Anyway, that's Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. Now, there is a potential problem with that strategy if we were to regulate an industry like that and say, okay, here's the you can't charge any more than what your average total cost is, and just leave it at that. Well, wouldn't take long for the monopolist to say, okay, they tell me I can set my price equal to my average total cost. Okay, so new office remodels for everybody, 96-inch flat screen TV in everybody's office, leather chair, you know, I mean, there wouldn't be any incentive for them to control cost, right? Just let costs go and, you know, what's it to them? They're living in a nice, comfy office space at our expense. So it's not usually good enough that you would just set a policy such that and keep it as simple as, well, just charge whatever your average total cost is. In fact, that's unheard of. We don't do that. In theory, that sounds good, but they would not have an incentive to maintain that low cost then anymore if that were a regulation. So usually we will do some hybrid version of the fair price strategy and say, well, essentially you're going to be setting your price equal to your average total cost, but we're going to keep an eye on what your average total cost is too. And that's exactly what Public Utilities Commission does with utilities like telecommunications, although telecommunications is not as much, there's so much competition in telecommunications anymore that you probably entirely do away with any telecommunications regulations in that regard. They do the same thing with natural gas. You have a lot of choices with natural gas where you get your natural gas from. They don't come in and rip out all the natural gas lines when you choose a new provider. Vectren Energy is who owns although I heard they're selling Vectren. I don't know if that's gone through yet, but that in this area, Vectren owns primarily the infrastructure that actually gets the electricity into our house. All right, any questions about that? But another potential problem with the fair price strategy is that gets us to productive efficiency, but it doesn't get us to allocative efficiency. Remember, to be allocatively efficient, you've got to set the price equal to the marginal cost. Now, again, demand's a reflection of price always, so look for where that marginal cost curve intersects the demand curve, and that's over here at Q sub R. I'm assuming, I don't know why he uses R there, I guess maybe the regulated price or something. Anyway, if we wanted to make it such that we actually did, from society's standpoint, get the greatest amount of consumer benefit to us, then we'd have to set the price equal to marginal cost. And we call that the socially optimal price strategy. Socially optimal because that's where we actually we're allocating the right amount of resources to the production of this good. So if we regulated a company in that way, you can see that we would pay even less, good for us, and we get more output, good for us. If we regulated this company, this is the monopoly. Remember, all of these market models look at this from the perspective of the individual producer that's doing this. So this is one firm that's looking at this scenario. Would this firm even break even? They would not, because if that's the price they get per unit and the average total cost is above that, obviously they're losing money, correct? So they would suffer an economic loss if we were to regulate them over here to this socially optimum price. Well, if we did that and just left it at that, then this monopolist would just fold up and go home, right? They'd say, well, you can regulate me to that price if you want, but you can't make me stay in business. We can do a lot of things with regulation, but we can't hold a gun to somebody's head and say, you're going to provide this for society, whether you want to or not. So they would just go out of business, right? Well, what if we wanted that socially optimal outcome for some reason, but we still did, obviously we need somebody to provide whatever the service is. How could we do that? Yeah, you subsidize them, exactly. That's the only way you could regulate an industry or a producer to the socially optimal price and not have them take their toys and go home, so to speak, would be you would have to subsidize them. Anybody think of an example of how we do that in reality? Any monopoly type good you can think of that we actually do subsidize? It's none of the utilities, I'll give you that hint. Farming? We do subsidize farmers, to be sure, but that's not a monopoly industry. And the reason we subsidize farmers is so that we can't, there's lots of reasons, but the reason we subsidize farmers is because we want to protect our domestic food source. We don't want them to succumb to foreign competition. So I'm not arguing the merits of agricultural subsidies. We do subsidize them a lot, but that's not an example of this because that's not a monopoly type industry. I'll give you a hint. They're now green, although some are still yellow. Big green rectangles on wheels with people in them. move people from point A to point B.
Oh, buses.
The RTA. The RTA is a great example of this. Regional Transit Authority here in Montgomery County. I don't even know what they charge. It's been a while since I've ridden an RTA bus. What is it, $1.50 now, I think? Somebody said, anybody ride the RTA? I always ask that question, and almost nobody rides the RTA anymore. It's like, I don't get that, because every time I see one, it's full of people. Somebody's riding the RTA. It's just not our student. They even come here, don't they? Doesn't the RTA come to this building? I don't know. You know what it costs to ride the RTA?
I think it's 2 now.
Is it 2 now? Wow.
It's been a while since I-
Wow. Well, you might be right, because I know I know it was $1.50 at one time, actually. Now that I think about it, and that has been a while ago, so maybe it is $2. Let's say it's $2 that the RTA charges you to get from point A to point B. Trust me when I say that is not what it actually costs the RTA to get you from point A to point B. And I don't mean that it costs them less than that and they're making a ton of money. What I mean is it costs them actually probably far more than $2 per person to get each person from point A to point B. And so what we've done is the Regional Transit Authority is a government body that is the people that make up the board of the Regional Transit Authority. I'm not an expert on the RTA, but I think they are appointed by county commission. I know they report to the county commission if they're not appointed by them. And so this Regional Transit Authority, the commission, is what oversees the whole RTA system. And the point is, it costs them a lot of money. I mean, you think about it, what must even just one of those brand new green buses we see nowadays cost? I think those things are probably $3 million a piece. I don't know. I have no idea, but I'm sure they're not cheap. I know what I paid for my car, so I can imagine what those are going for. Not to mention the fact, anybody know any RTA drivers? Marry one. Those RTA drivers make a buttload of money. It's unbelievable what those guys make. I'm not exaggerating. Those guys can make like $80,000 to $100,000 a year, depending upon how much you want to drive. So, point is, it's really expensive to get people from point A to point B on the RTA. Trust me when I say it's more than $2, I guarantee it. Surprises a lot of people. A lot of people think $2 from point A to point B. I'm going 3 blocks down. Well, walk your ass 3 blocks then if you don't want to pay $2. I mean, it's not cheap. So, how does the RTA continue to exist? Well, we subsidize them. And a lot of people don't know that, but your Montgomery County tax dollars go to subsidize the RTA. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, I'm saying it is what it is. We subsidize the RTA. Without that subsidy, the RTA would not exist. There's no company would provide that service were it not for our ability to subsidize the RTA. So we subsidize them and get them up here to this average total cost. So basically, if they're earning a fair return, I would argue they're probably doing way more than a fair return, but that's a whole political debate. Why do we? I mean, we don't care, right? I mean, when's the last time you saw somebody picking it out in front of a RTA? Abolish the RTA. I've never seen that. Been here my whole life. I've never seen that. But we're obviously okay with subsidizing the RTA. What's society's rationale for subsidizing the RTA? Why is nobody bothered by the fact that we subsidize the RTA? And I'm not suggesting you should be bothered by it, by the way.
It's providing a low cost, efficient way.
Relatively very low cost, even at $2 to get from point A to point B when you look at the price of providing your own transportation. You have alternatives too, right? I mean, you can, they're not a true monopoly in a monopoly sense, because, you can walk, you can ride a bike, you can Uber to work or wherever you need to go. I mean, you have lots of alternatives, so you're not stuck with just the RTA, which makes the point even more important. Why do we subsidize it? Well, trust me, nobody's riding the RTA for fun, right? Any more than I get in my car and go to work because it's fun to drive to work. I mean, I know some people like driving. The point is, people are using the RTA for, they're using it, they're not joyriding the RTA, right? They're using the RTA to get to work, to school, shopping. All of those are valuable economic resources, right? Going to school is human capital development. Shopping is an obvious economic benefit. People are going out and spending money. going to work, earning a paycheck. So lots of good reasons why people use the RTA. So there are some situations where we justifiably will subsidize the existence of a monopoly because trust me, no competitors beating down the doors in Montgomery County, Ohio saying, I'm going to run that RTA out of business. I'm going to start my own bus company, right? The barriers to entry there would be so significant. I mean, you look at the infrastructure associated with the RTA and frankly, the rest of the system. All right.